It's time for fun, learning, commentary, laughs, and more. Care of the most diverse group in the genealogy and family history world.
BlackProGen Live.
BlackProGen Live. Welcome to BlackProGen Live with your hosts, Nika and True, and the baddest panel in these pedigree streets.
BlackProGen.
BlackProGen Live.
BlackProGen Live.
Alito, chumachukma.
The unapologetic Black and people of color viewpoint.
Genealogy, family history research with flavor. In the season 7 premiere, which is tonight, we'll detail the who, what, when, where, how, and why around why our ancestors left the Deep South and migrated to cities like St. Louis, Gary, Indianapolis, Chicago, Cincinnati, Detroit, Milwaukee, and more. Thanks so much for joining us for the season 7 premiere of BlackProGen Live, Migrations 55, 57, 65, and 75 North. As always, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss a single thing, BlackProGen Live or otherwise. And you have to make sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook. Of course, we also now have an Instagram account if you have not already found us. So if you haven't, you need to go ahead and get your @BlackProGen on with that. And be sure to set your reminders so that you are never ever left out of anything that we're posting, sharing, all kinds of stuff. And before we get deep into tonight's episode, I want to make sure that I give honor and respect to one of our elders that recently passed away. Um, what can I say about Miss Vicky? Miss Vicky was an incredible individual. She was a seminal part of Afrogenius, and she recently passed away in Phoenix from COVID-19. We also lost BJ Smothers, who was also a seminal part of Afrogenius, and there would not be a BlackProGen Live and really a lot of what we see in terms of African American genealogy and family history research without Afrogenius and without those two women. And of course, we know and recognize that everyone is losing so many people right now. In fact, we buried my husband's uncle today from COVID-19. But we definitely have to make sure that we pay homage to those that paved the way for this show, as well as anyone that you may have lost or anything you may have encountered. And so I just wanted to go ahead and set the evening off with that. But we've got a stacked panel for tonight's episode. I'm glad to see all of these faces. It feels like it's been way too long. Hello, howdy doody. I'm gonna start off with the youngest because I normally start off with the oldest. Hey, Alex, how are you?
Hey, y'all. Happy season kickoff. I hope that this season leads to some really great breakthroughs and tons of information for all of our viewers.
Great. Next up, I think, Carmen, it's you. Sorry.
Hey, Nick. Hey, everybody. I'm Carmen from St. Louis and happy to be here and excited about the subject.
Good, good. All right. James, I think you're next.
Good evening, everybody. I'm James Morgan, and I am Black in America.
That's wonderful. All right. True Ann, I don't quite know what that was supposed to be, but whatever.
I let it mean whatever it means to you.
Got it. All right. Go ahead, True.
I was going to let Linda go first.
We're going in reverse chronological order tonight. Okay. So technically you're supposed to go next.
All right. So I'm getting some props there. Welcome back, everybody. It is so good to see you all here. We made it. We made it through the holidays, and we're almost going to get there to the finish line. So I just want to tell everybody I see you out in the chat room, and I'm just so glad that you all have came back for season 7. So
good. There's a question in the chat room. Where did I get my t-shirt? Target. Black Beyond Measure. If you haven't put your order in, you probably should because they sell out. I've gotten way too many t-shirts. That's my go-to source for my Black History Month t-shirt is Target. So yes, get your Target on. You can go online and get them there. Grandma Linda. Fly
Hello.
Linda with a tiled wall, Linda.
Season 7, greetings everybody. I'm Linda Sims from St. Louis, Missouri, and glad to be back another season.
The elder statesman, the love of our lives, the auntie. She's like, me? Yes, you. Wait, you're on mute, Shelly.
Statesman.
Stateswoman.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. This is Shelly from Central Virginia. Glad to be here for season 7. And you know what? We're going to be all right.
All right, Kendrick Lamar, look at you over here quoting the young people and the lyrics and whatnot. All right, Auntie Shelly. Y'all, there are a lot of people here this evening. We're just glad again that you guys would join us for such an incredible topic. We all have been super looking forward to talking about this particular topic. Of course, I got to remind everybody that there are some episodes that kind of tie into some of the subject matter that we're going to be talking about tonight. There's a state-specific playlist. So those are episodes that deal with specific states that we're going to talk about tonight and just how to research there from an African-American genealogy perspective. Also, we are going to talk about interviewing for family history and genealogy research. I think a number of us in the planning for the show actually did do this to really gain a more additional insight outside of what we already knew. And so that super crucial, super just super important. And I feel like it's really going to shift our conversation tonight. The fact that some of us have actually, you know, in addition to living this experience, have talked to our elders, and it's re-engaged us in just a new and a fresh way for genealogy. So we apologize if the show is longer than it usually is, because this is going to be real good. After that, Lord, this thing that fell out my ear, Lord Jesus. All right. All right. So from there, Rights of Life, religious, fraternal, and benevolent societies. That's your Knights of Pythias, your Masons, all of that stuff that totally, you know, completely ties into what we're talking about tonight. Newspapers for people of color genealogy research. Gosh, what can we say? In fact, some of the news coverage we're going to be talking about and sharing tonight is as a result, the boon of it is as a result of the Great Migration. And then last but not least, and remember, this is not an all-inclusive list because this is episode 126, so there may be some tie over into others. We're going to suggest to you to watch Tales from the Undertaker, African-American Cemeteries, and Funeral Homes. Of course, you get to see me and True and all of our Fascinator glory that evening, with True and her orange Fascinator being entirely extra with our red funeral lips. All right, so panel, let's go ahead and qualify the conversation, right? Because this episode is actually one of a series that we're doing, just like we did last year with the census, right? We had a whole series of episodes on the census. We're doing episodes this year that are framed around the Great Migration, right? And to the, you know, main locations that everyone, for the most part, went. And that's aligned along with our theme for the season, which is crew and community, right? Community research and how that is so important. You've heard us talk about it a million times throughout the history of the show. And now, of course, this year, we are going to have a specific focus on community and how it rounds out our genealogy research. So to qualify things for this episode in particular, we know you want to talk about LA. We know you want to talk about Phoenix. We know you want to talk about Dallas, but we ain't talking about that tonight. We're talking about St. Louis, East St. Louis, okay? That's Carmen. She's in the house, right? Her and Linda in the house in St. Louis, okay? Chicago, right? Not only just Chicago, but Danville, Illinois, some of the train stop locations. Indiana, places like Indianapolis, or as my folks say, Gay. You know where Gay, Indiana is? As in Gary, right?
Gary,
it's a place.
Yes.
It's a place,
Puff,
right?
Puff. It's real hazy,
Yes.
smoky, smelly. Sorry for the
Yes.
Gary people.
I know she totally just threw all of my family and Gary under the bus, but that's all right.
I'm sorry. I'm from Michigan.
My grandmother used to say Gary.
Geary. Oh my gosh, almost like Geary Avenue in San Francisco. That's hilarious. Okay, so in addition to that, Detroit, right? Saginaw, Flint, Michigan, okay, Ohio, places like Cleveland, Columbus. I'm probably leaving out a lot, but we're really particularly talking about Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and even you could even throw in Kansas, right? In some aspects, but we're really focusing on the Midwest. And the time period that we're talking about is from 1915 to 1914, and then from 1940 to 1970, which are the really huge chunks or blocks that address the Great Migration. And again, to qualify the conversation, we're talking about recent history here. We're not really talking about anything pre 1915. We'll probably allude to it, but that's not the bulk of the conversation because we're missing so much as researchers because we're not really taking the time to cover this time span in the rush to get back to our enslaved ancestors or to get back to Africa. We're skipping over the living history that is among us. And I think I can speak for the rest of us on the show and say, I think we all went through that covering this episode, right? Like we were like, hey, oh my gosh, like goodness gracious. How am I not dealing with this at this point? So anything off the top of your head to stop a conversation? Of course, we know people left due to opportunity, right? Lack thereof, where their family was from. And you know what? I think all of us have ties to these locations. Let's shout those out. My folks are through and through Chicago, South Side, baby. That's where my folks are now. If they're watching from the South Side right now. Same thing with Gary in Detroit, St. Louis. I think I have people who went to every single one of these states in my family. Anyone else besides me care to weigh in?
Cincinnati.
Yeah, Ohio stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot of family cousins that went to Ohio and some in Chicago.
I always like to say Daddy had all of us in 5 different states. So we went from the South to East Chicago to Toledo, and then we ended up in Pennsylvania. So
yeah, I would throw in there my on different sides of my family's been in Missouri for like 800 years, which is really weird. Like I've never met anybody like myself. But at least on my grandfather's side, I know his oldest sister is the one that came to St. Louis from Haywood County, Tennessee first. And it was like a train, like everybody, once she got here and got situated, then all her siblings started coming up here to the point that eventually I think most of them ended up leaving Tennessee. And I think there's maybe 2 that stayed out of the 14 of them. So that means that 12 of them left Tennessee and came to, St. Louis. And some of them did kind of go off to Memphis. But so I just noticed that was a thing because I would go through family pictures and I'm like, my granddad and all his brothers are like hanging out. And I'm like, all of y'all were here? So I had to ask my dad. He was like, yeah, they all came up after Aunt Mildred came up here. And so, it was really nice to just see them keep that closeness with themselves, even though they left their original home place.
Good. Linda?
Yeah, my family, when they left Mississippi, on my mom's side, they came straight to St. Louis. And my grandmother's house was the stopping place. Everybody bunked there until they got their own place, and then went on to Milwaukee and into Chicago. My dad's side, same thing. They came here. And then my great uncle left Mississippi, went straight to Gary, Indiana, to work at the steel mill. So that was a big draw. So between St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, Flint, Michigan, that was our stopping places. And they came up here in 1930. My great grandfather in 1930, and then it seemed like everyone followed after that.
And do you guys, with regard to folks moving from location to location, right? Obviously, jobs were probably the number one biggest motivator. What were some of the job opportunities that your family members got once they left? Because I know for mine, it was moving from the agricultural type of jobs, sharecropping, or, even maybe people owning their own land, or the children of the person that owns the land not wanting to take the land over and, literally working themselves to the bone, being, subjected to waiting for rain and all those other things, right? And then moving into jobs where they could retire, right, with a pension and have benefits and things like that. The stuff was taken care of. I can speak, to my grandmother. My grandmother got a job at Campbell Soup. The first opportunity she got to not be a domestic and not to have to pick cotton, honey, she jumped at the opportunity. And my mom talks about getting the holiday tomato soup cans with her name on it from Campbell's. And I'm like, Mommy, where's the can of soup? She ate it. But you know what I mean? But I'm like, I wish she would have kept the soup, because then that way, that would have been a memento. But what are the types of jobs that you all's families got once they left? Did they do the same thing where they left these agricultural jobs and then, went to sort of factory, urban sort of positions?
The railroad.
My grandmother came up here and became a seamstress. She worked at a dress factory. My dad, Wagner Electric, the electric company here. That was seemed like all of the males worked at Wagner Electric or some type of warehouse, packing houses. The meat packing houses was another one.
Swift Packing House, that's where my grandfather worked.
Yeah.
For me, a lot of the movement was actually related to the military. Both of my grandfathers were veterans, and even on my mom's side, there was a short stint where people actually went out to California because of the increase in jobs there with with Navy production and whatnot. They didn't stay there a terribly long time, but it was oftentimes related to that for me.
Carmen, you mentioned the railroads. That's definitely another thing, because I know my Kansas City people, there's a picture I have. In fact, I want to get it blown up of my grandmother's brother and all of his co-workers, and they just look like a Chico DeBarge video. I just can't even think of like it's just a whole bunch of it's like you could just see Aldous Hodge and all of the men's together working on the railroad and whatnot. Yes, all of the men's.
Well, Chico and them were across on the other side from me from the school in Grand Rapids. So don't believe that about them being raised up in Detroit. They were in Grand Rapids and right at the back of the school. But anyway, ours was factory work and janitorial work, still domestic type work. And again, coming in the north, the Tennessee to Fort Wayne, Indiana folks also went into kind of like the industrial work, but they weren't that far from the agricultural stuff. But I also think it had to do with the benevolent society and finding one connection where they were at in Tennessee, and then finding, I'm going to say, brothers up in Fort Wayne, because there was some connection there. So very interesting why they moved though.
Yeah. Well, do you all, obviously, especially for, I think all of us, we're talking about people fleeing oppression in the Deep South, right? And the racial tensions and all of those things. Do you all have any stories around when your ancestors left, right? Was there some sort of a seminal event from when they left the Deep South and moved up north? Because Shelley, I know your folks, there was a reason why they left Indiana and moved to Michigan. But that was a second. You know what I mean? Michigan was a second stop for them. It wasn't the first stop. Do you all have any stories or anything with regard to, and that's one thing. I think we all have heard the story around, we had to leave in the middle of the night because we owed so-and-so some money and they, and we needed to pay them, or they didn't want us to leave, or, any of those things. Alex, you just over here so quiet. Did you want to talk about the jobs before we move on?
I have a comment that kind of ties in both questions. So my family moved from Lower Alabama to Detroit, in Cincinnati, Ohio, specifically Lincoln Heights neighborhood of Cincinnati, which is a very historically Black neighborhood. But they moved from basically my great grandfather and his siblings all moved from Owasso, Alabama, up to the area, primarily because of the automobile industry in Detroit, but also because education jobs in Cincinnati. So half of the brothers and siblings were educators, and the other half were more so the like blue collar workers. And their mother was an educator, so she took a job in Cincinnati, and slowly but surely started to send her sons up to Detroit and other parts of the Midwest. But one of the seminal reasons of why they left was mostly just because of land settlement. Their father was an heir of a little bit of property, but basically, after his debts and everything were settled, they were like, okay, we ain't gonna be farmers, so let's just sell it off to the paper company, and then go and establish ourselves in places where we can buy good homes, provide good education for our children, and so on and so forth. And then also, with the dissolution of that estate, there really wasn't no room for no Black folks to live in Alabama anymore, unless you were down there like doing sharecropping work or farming your own land. So that was a big thing, was just the kind of push out from basically displacement, for all intents and purposes, an early form of displacement.
Well, and I think you also bring up an important point too that we're going to touch on later with regard to land loss and how land loss is tied to this migration. And the fact that it's almost as though maybe the folks that you're talking about saw maybe that was something that was happening, or they were just like, you know what, we're willing to kind of strike out and just, you know what I mean, just do it, just to make sure that that we can ensure certain things. So, there's a mention in the chat room. I was told my grandfather has some issue with the white man, but that was secondhand info. I was never able to confirm it. I have a cousin who is literally in her 80s right now, who was scared to tell me about the circumstances around her mother and her father leaving Arkansas and going to California, eventually going to California. And it was one of those stories where we had to leave late. We couldn't, we had to switch our names at school. And I mean, it was all kinds of, a lot of trauma associated with trying to free yourself, right? And it mirrors the situation that you see with people trying to escape slavery, who were enslaved, right? Who were trying to get to Canada or maybe Ohio, right? Because that was a free state at the time. Also around land, right? The opportunity to buy land, right? And depending on the state that you were in and the location that you were living in, right? A lot of that could dictate whether or not you had the possibility to buy land. Maybe the land that you were settling on, that you've done improvements on, was not available to you because the person wouldn't sell, or maybe there were restrictive covenants, right? There were laws that prohibited home ownership from Black people, right? All across the country. So you have to weigh, right? These are definitely the reasons why people left. We also brought up religious and social organizations, oh, hey, all the Prince Hall Masons are picking up and they're working on the railroad and they're going to go move to, wherever the destination of choice is. Let's talk about the role of the military, right? We kind of hit on that a little bit with James. World War I know that literally is the reason why my family left. It's because my grandmother's brother was in World War II. And it was like the minute that Uncle King started seeing the world, he came back home, told Granny and them, it was a wrap. Like, it was like, oh, they don't treat us like this everywhere. Oh my gosh, and I almost feel like that phrase my mom uses about people not acting like they ain't went nowhere before comes from comes from that. But did you guys have that scenario? Because my uncle ended up in Chicago, and that's how it started, the whole chain sort of migration out of Louisiana. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, I was going to say this was my first shock growing up, and I was probably 18 or 19. And again, I'm in Grand Rapids. Well, I have an uncle who died a couple years ago, and he was from Lauderdale, Mississippi. And he would have been born, they assume or projected that he was born about 1917. And Meridian was the town. And what it was, he didn't have a birth certificate, but when he registered for World War II, based on input from his sisters, remembered, hey, he was born and it was fall time. And so they gave him the birth date of September 17th or something. But anyway, Uncle Julius, very active in the community. and with the ladies and these kind of things and stuff. And he was working at General Motors, and he got me onto General Motors. But what was interesting, I remember walking down the street with him, and we were going to get some food. And I stood there, and it was like, what the H? He stepped off of the sidewalk. I had never seen that. 2 white people were coming towards us. So that was my like, wait, what's going on? 17, 18 years old, and something's not right. But why would he step off and the head went down almost in a submissive row? I had never seen that. And again, to about 17, 18 years old, and had to get educated on that from my dad. And he had came from Meridian and a whole 9 yards, and y'all know what I'm talking about, just the racial disparities of the whites and the blacks and all of that stuff. And he came up north and still had that. And so that would have been in the late 50s, early 60s, that he still mentally needed to step off for the white people coming towards him. That was an eye opener for me. And he came and went into the factory and retired from the factory. Definitely a little better off than what he would have been if he would have stayed in Mississippi. And again, he came after the war. So,
well, can I say something about the military?
Yeah, for me,
yeah, it was the military.
Yeah, so I was just going to say real quick that I think it was true then, and I think it's true now, that the military is kind of like a catalyst. So like if you're someplace where you don't want to be and you don't have the money yourself to pick up and move, the military is something that you can join that will take you somewhere. It's kind of like college is kind of that way as well. And so I know that the minute my grandfather, and I think pretty much all of his brothers and even some of their sons joined the military as a way to get out of not sharecropping, because they actually own their own land, but farming. They didn't want to farm for the rest of their lives. And so they didn't have the money themselves to like pick up and like go and set up a whole new life somewhere else. Right. So you join the military. And I think that was true then. And I think that's true for folks now too.
Yeah, for me, actually, I have a story that illustrates that point exactly. My paternal grandfather, James Sr., he actually told me this. He wasn't really a big storyteller, but one of the stories he did tell me about when he joined the military, he said that he got on the bus and went to basic training or what have you. And the white man got on the bus and started calling off names and telling people where to report, and that he actually was the last person on the bus. And he asked the guy, he said, "Well, sir, you didn't call my name." And he said, "Well, what's your name, son?" And he told him his name, James Morgan, same as me. And he said, "Oh, that's right. Yeah, we got a call about you. The man said we got to send you back because you owe him 2 more seasons on, back on that farm, wherever you come from." And my grandfather told me, he said he told that gentleman, that soldier, he said, "Sir, when I woke up this morning, I got on my knees and I prayed to my Lord and Savior, and I promised him that today was the day I was going to start killing white folks. So now either you can send me back there and I can kill him, or you can send me overseas and I can go kill some Germans and people. Which one do you want?" And the guy looked at him and said, "All right, son, get off the bus." And literally that launched his, he served in World War II. And ultimately that's what ended up helping lead him. One of the things that helped lead him to leave North Carolina and end up in New Jersey. Hence, I'm from New Jersey. Now, I don't know what launched that whole thing, but that's what happened.
Well, I mean, that's again another example, right? Because a lot of us have these stories, right? These same instances, and some of these things are extremely hard to trace on paper, right? What we may only have the oral history. There may not be, like, you can't assume that man that made that call had a notepad sitting there and wrote down that he talked to James Morgan Sr., right? We can't assume that, right? And so this is where we allow the oral history narrative to take the drive, right? And for us to do our due diligence to try to verify as much as we possibly can, right? Like who were the major planters at the time living in the area that your family was living in before they left the South, right? What kind of impact did they have on that location? Were they movers and shakers? Were they a part of the aristocracy of that area? Because one of the things I think all of us are well aware of, especially those of us that do Deep South research, and we have to go back into these locations, is that those families that were running things when our folks left are still running them now. And so their paper trail is long and strong. Okay. And so that may be right. The way that you find these stories and you unearth these nuggets and details is look to see what the agreements were that your family had in place that are maybe in deed books or conveyance books in the ancestral locations, right? Look to see if you can find mentions of these families in the newspaper. What, how much money were they making? What type of industry were they in? Were they elected officials, right? And here's the thing, we need to stop being minded around, well, my ancestor's name has to be there. Because this is not a scenario where we're relying on the census taker to go and tell us the information. This is Carmen called her grandma, Alex talked to his grandma, Nika talked to her mama, True talked to her older siblings, right? Or her aunts or her uncles. James called people in his family, right? These are first person accounts. And when we make it so based on what the history book says about stuff that living people can tell us, we are really, really, really missing the mark on what we could be documenting right now. So I really just want to make sure that we keep that front of mind as we have this conversation, because yes, we can send you down 15 rabbit holes to go and find documents. But if you don't sit down and interview the people who were alive, who can really speak to this experience, you're missing the biggest asset that you possibly could have to retell this story to future generations of your family. I just have to put that out there. The other thing to consider is the people who were left behind. We spend so much time talking about, oh, they left, right? Oh, the people left, right? But what about the people that got left behind? Let's talk about them, right? Because in my family, the aunt and the uncle that didn't leave, Lord have mercy. You might not have looked. My grandmother's siblings, there were 9 of them, okay? Out of the 9, 7 of them left the state of Louisiana. The only 2 that stayed were involved in the civil rights movement. That's why I make that comment. So, and I know my uncle had resentment because he couldn't leave because he had too many kids. He couldn't how was Joseph going to load up Willie Mae and 12 children in a car? What car were they taking? Where they was going to fit everybody in the car? Where were they going? Like, I'm serious. No.
They needed to hop on a train.
That's what I'm saying. But who gonna get train money? That's like McDonald's money. Where's the train money?
Yeah.
For you and 13 children, especially think about the family structures that we had, you guys, during this time span where people were still having a lot of children and those children were working that farm. The number of kids you had could have completely derailed your opportunities to get out of these locations. Come on now. They didn't have no Planned Parenthood in Lake Providence, Louisiana. Let's have a frank talk, y'all. So, let's talk about, relay some of the experiences you guys have heard about where the people couldn't leave or they didn't have the chance to leave because of this, that, or the third.
Nikki, we were having that conversation last week. I need to go back and check on some of those that are still there and ask, why are you still here when everybody else left? One cousin came to St. Louis and then went back down there. And I'm like, what made you go back? And she's still there today. So that's a gap in my research that I need to go back and get those stories before it's too late.
I could also speak to that. So my mother was born in Owasso, Alabama in 1962. She was like literally one of the last children caught by a midwife in the state before it became, taboo. But nonetheless, her mother and father were visiting for the holidays, coming from, I think at the time they were both teaching at Tuskegee, but had been living in LA for, the last decade of their lives for the most part. So anyways, they were there for the holidays, had my mother, and they stayed until the spring and went back to Tuskegee and then went back to LA, leaving, following that. But growing up, my mother always had, every summer she was going back to Alabama and, really basically grew up partially in Owasso, just like her mother, and literally almost 200 years of her family had been living right there on that same soil. So by the time that I came along, I also grew up making the same trek each year. So I say that all to say, I think that for a lot of people, this idea of being left behind isn't necessarily the case. Because a lot of folks, for instance, my family in California, we were redlined, we were gerrymandered, we was beat up, beat down, and all the things in between, crack epidemic, ghettos, all that. And my family in Alabama literally lived on the land that we've been owning for the last 100+ years. So they're college educated. They're doing just fine besides some of the disparities, of course, like Dr. Murphy mentioned earlier, that exist down there. But there's this sense of indigeneity to those places for a lot of people. So like the conversation around being left behind should also include those that chose intentionally to stay. Because I have several aunts and uncles that are like, we ain't never leaving. We ain't for that leaving. For my family in New Orleans, that came here earlier than my family in Alabama, you know, they had the storms, they had the lynchings, they had the this and the that, and yet they chose to stay. So my great great grandparents chose to stay in New Orleans, and several of their children. And you know, like up until literally, I have cousins that up until 2005 in the hurricane were asked, okay, well, do you want to just come and stay in the Bay Area or in LA to get away from this? The conversation is, no, we ain't for that leaving, you know, and there's an intentionality around that too. So I think that we have to have like a dual conversation around the fact that there also was power in staying close to home, where your people had been, where you know how to navigate. You move to we moved to the north, into the Midwest, into the LAs and things, and you don't know how them white monsters move in those communities. You don't know how to navigate that. We good down here. And I think that that's something that I really didn't understand until after I started college, to really see like my younger cousins that were thriving in a way that I had never seen Black folks in California thrive in my life, California or Detroit.
Right.
Carmen?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I wanted to echo your comment about how important the folks are that stayed, because I don't know about anybody else, but when I'm stuck on a research question or I can't figure something out, I love that I can call like my cousin Olivia or my cousin Nisi, and I'll say, have you heard of this person? Oh, let me call him real quick. And they just like, and they have these connections and relationships that are decades long, that who knows how long it would take me if I show up as a rando. Like, I think that some people would know who my families were, but they're not necessarily going to be open to like you showing up and asking questions, and they just sit there and answer your questions. So I think that sometimes they can lend some credibility to you as a researcher when you make those visits back to your ancestral homelands, and you need to talk to people. Like Nika said, when you're not in the history books and the records, but you got to talk to people that were there. Those are the people that are going to open the doors for you.
Shelley?
I think it also, in following up with some of what Alex was saying and also Carmen, but think of legacy. And I don't want to compare it to a TV show like Queen or whatever. It was about the dirt. It was about the land and how they got the land and what happened, but also they had to fight to hold on it. So there was also benefit that a few were able to leave and then help support those that stayed behind. So I think legacy and the roots, that type thing, I think was really important, and to hold on what was left for the family. And I grew up in the environment where my daddy felt owning real estate was the way how you beat or you got to some equivalency, was to have home ownership. So of course he went into real estate, and I did the same thing in one of my brothers, but there was the value and the pride of ownership that went with that. And that is still strong, I think, in the Deep South as well, that you know, so many generations and things. So, and I think about Queen because of that, the show that was on HBO, and it was how they got the land, and Bernice Bennett's Clark, you remember him, and homesteading and things. And it was fighting to even keep that when it rightfully became theirs. So I think that's
True.
another reason.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what Alex said, because after I was sitting here listening, and I have it actually documented in my documentary with the elders that stayed in Alabama. They had this sense of pride, this belonging, this community. You know, they're there on the documentary telling you why they stayed. You know, they loved that they came out of that one room schoolhouse out of merit, and that we can go back. I always like to say about Daddy, because he was in World War II. So he saw things totally different. And I think when he came back to Alabama and he tried to share crop and stay with his people, he just knew that that just wasn't the life that he wanted to live, but he still had that connection. I always say, Daddy might have left Alabama, but Alabama didn't leave Daddy. And he kept that going with us, you know, us kids. Like, we had to leave Pennsylvania for every funeral. Every summer when Daddy took off at New Cumberland Army Depot, we had to go down home. That was how I grew up, even though my siblings are grown. They're like way much older than me, and I'm the last child. I still, you know, a child of the 60s, I still had that connection, just like if I was born in the 40s or the 50s. But just like Alex, I feel like that about my family, because I have talked to so many of them, and I still, like Carmen said, I can call down there right now and ask a question. But there was just this sense of pride of just, you know, they weren't worried about leaving like Daddy was. But I think his experience from the war just changed his view and how he wanted us, because we are that kind of that branch that kind of just went off, and Daddy exposed us to different things. And I feel like when we were talking last week, I felt kind of like maybe we did kind of miss some of that. Like, why didn't Daddy force us, like me, to go to TU or go to a HBCU? You know, all that is in play. We had to, you know, go to PWIs. Daddy did a lot of maneuvering around to get us where we are today, but it still all stems from our connection down home, down in Alabama. So,
James?
No, I agree with everything that's being said here. I wanted to go back to what Carmen said earlier, because this is something that I've experienced myself as well. When you're not from that place that you're researching, I'm a child or a grandchild of the Great Migration, right? So I have connections and I have memories and I've made trips. But when I started doing my research, I'm calling people at first who I know very well. And over time, I'm accumulating numbers and email addresses for relatives that I've never met before. So one of the strategies that I've adopted to when I'm calling relatives, I always try to make sure I give what I call an anchor point for them, because I'm thinking about, happy birthday to my cousin Cynthia, who she just had a birthday yesterday. I always think about that first time that I called my cousin Cynthia, my grandmother's second cousin. She didn't know who the heck I was from a can of paint. But the first thing I said was, I'm Evelyn's grandson. And she goes, oh, Evelyn's grandson? And then we start talking. Now she's one of my closest relatives, closest friends in the whole wide world, right? So be cognizant of that if you are in a situation like that. If you're calling from Los Angeles and you calling back down to Georgia or Texas or Tennessee or wherever, and you're reaching out, or if you're going down there in person, what have you, it's always good, especially if you don't have, like me, my surname comes from my father's side. When I do a lot of research on my mom's side, they're like, Morgan, ain't no Morgans down here, So make sure that you that you give that anchor point, and don't just be the detached genealogy person calling, because that's how you get, especially you call older folks, that's how you get the phone hung up on you. They think you're trying to sell them something, as they say down south.
What you said, and not only that, but it's, again, when you aren't making that investment, when your investment is, I spent $99 on this DNA test and I want you to take it because you're the oldest person. Can we do a collective calling out of ourselves right now, right? Where you aren't calling, checking on the person, sending them things that you've learned, especially if they have sown into you their research or what they know, right? You're doing drive-by genealogy. Why would they want to share it with you, right? And again, remember, the time period and the stuff we're talking about, you guys, there are so many pieces of this that we don't have access to, and it's going to be another 40 years before we get it. maybe 50. Right? So this is yet and still a reminder to go and to check those locations and to be with the people. I want to share some articles before we move into the next set of the discussion. And the Chicago Defender was off the chain with their coverage of things. We found quite a few articles. Savannah alarmed over labor exodus. Let me read it so ominously. The exodus of members of the race for the North has caused an increasing alarm among the white businessmen of Savannah. They have sought the aid of some of the preachers who, for a paltry sum of gold, tell their congregants that the weather up north is colder than they can stand. Yet despite this class of men and their aid, hundreds continue to leave daily. Strict laws have been passed prohibiting the recruiting of men by white labor agents of the factories and railroads. The men will not be fooled, however, for they have hired several smooth members of the race to collect men into groups and ship them away. Many have gone to the coal mines in Virginia and some to Pennsylvania to work for the railroad company. Others have gone to Chicago, where they readily found work in Stockyards District. A recent letter from one of those who went north says that over 500 eat with the whites at the Libby plant. Oh, Lord. 500 Negroes is eating with the whites at the Libby plant? Yes, they did. And between the hours of 6 and 7 in the morning, you can find crowds of the race, men and women going to the different packet houses. Can you believe it? Men are given jobs where they have never been known to work before. Oh, clutch my pearls. There's a shortage of labor in the North. The Southerner admits this, but sees no way to stop the exodus. There's only one way, that is to recognize man for man, regardless of color, to give justice and education to all, and to abolish the lynch law and Jim Crow schools, and above all, give the race its vote and stop disenfranchising them. Don't you love how they just threw that shade at the end of the article? This is in 1916, you guys.
Nika, you told that just like a story.
The journalism training came in. Of course, I had to do all pearls clutching, right? So again, there are these stories. If you really want to learn, again, if you are really doing a study on your family, you are not just pulling records that have the names of your ancestors. You are pulling contextual things like what we're looking at right now to give you a better idea of the who, the what, the when, the where. There is no community unless you're looking at these things, right? So look at this one. Farewell, Dixieland. The other fellow is seldom in a position where he can decide what is best for you to do when the subject under consideration is a personal one. Yet the great I ams of the Wilsonian type who live in the land of cotton and sugarcane essay to tell the wishy-washy northerner that they know best how to deal with the colored people, having summered and wintered with them for dozens of years. And in the past, owing to the fact that the North, East, and West had but a few of the people in question in their midst, they swallowed this southern canard and stood for the treatment accorded them, brutal as it was, believing, as they were told, the punishment only fitted the crimes. Horrible pictures were painted and sent for northern consumption of big black brutes, committing some imaginary crime for the sake of southern womanhood, how the chivalrous mob wreaked vengeance on the culprit, as dastardly, as revolting, as inhuman as these scenes were. They were enacted at a distance and didn't strike the northerners as forcibly as they do now. Oh, Lord, they really cutting deep on this one, ain't they? They really went into a full, but Gone with the Wind synopsis. But look we went into all caps. They fight now. It's all caps. We must have the Negro in the South. He has been with us for so long that our whole industrial, commercial, and agricultural structure has been built on the Black foundation. It is only the labor. This is the only labor we have. It is the best we could possibly have. If we lose it, we go bankrupt. Was that good for y'all? Was that good enough? They went all caps.
I mean, at least he was.
I can see Mel standing on the podium doing that. You know, every slave movie, they got somebody up there hollering like that.
Yeah.
Nika, you just wrote a script.
Yeah. You sure did. That's the film script. That's the film script on CNN right now. Exactly what you just read in all caps.
But this is in the Defender, you guys, sure. Right? Yes, comments. They were pressed. Absolutely. They were going to do whatever they possibly could. This is, and here's the thing, this is a satire. This is in the Chicago Defender, you guys. This is the Defender, and standing in their intestinal fortitude is Black folks in the North who are free and liberated and have their own ink and paper to print on and produce daily, if not weekly, saying, Southerners, shut up. We can leave. We don't need your permission, right? And again, we're gone. You need to figure out another way to make money, because it's not going to be off of our backs, right?
Ooh,
So
I have to say
go
something,
ahead.
Nika, because I was reading the Warmth of Other Suns, and she didn't spend a lot of time on that part.
Right.
But when she talked about how they all of a sudden woke up and was like, who's going to do all of this work? Like, you really thought people were just going to stay there and to accept that bad treatment and live in a caste system just for their whole life, just so you could have wealth and prosperity. Like, I wish she had wrote about it more, because it was like that whole paragraph in caps that you just read, it was exactly that. Like, they were just like flabbergasted that people would get up and leave.
Well, and how dare you have the gall to walk out, right? Like, it's like, how dare you have the gall to walk out, right? Here's another, this is later, right? Juxtapose this, right? The first one I just shared was from the beginning, right? And then now we're hitting the second block at this point. Workers flock north for jobs. This war, like the First World War, is redistributing the Negro population. Negro workers, like white workers, are pouring into northern, eastern, and western industrial areas by tens of thousands. The Negroes are following well-worn paths, those from states along the Mississippi and the Ohio, like Kentucky, Louisiana, Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Mississippi. That's literally everybody on this panel's ancestry. Like, it's all of our cities, right? Migrating to Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, while Negroes from the South Atlantic states are pouring into Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. And see, here's something super important, and I see you all's hands, and I'm going to get to you. This was already identified by the Defender in 1944. There was no need to look at census data. There was no need to have a professor to come in and study it. They were using their eyes and their ears and their minds to interpret what they were seeing based on the coverage that the paper was doing. Because remember, Defender is a national paper, okay? And so again, this really speaks to us having agency over our stories and communicating what we're seeing, right? And what we're experiencing as it happens. One last one. And again, these articles are all over the place, where they just talk about the migration. And this is one of Mississippi had the worst reputation, of the reasons being the fact that in 1920, maybe six, there were 82,222 more Negroes in the state than whites. However, in 1930 and 1940, must be 20, census figures show that the white population exceeded the non-white. The 1950 census will, of course, increase the margin. Notice they're already prophesying over what they have already been seeing, okay? So go ahead and get your comments in, because you guys are chomping at the bit with the newspaper articles. And scene.
I had something that actually the second to last article that you showed kind of spoke to. One of the articles I know submitted that we didn't show. There was a real focus on one newspaper by Minister Bishop Benjamin Lee, talking about specifically trying to tell Black folks in Alabama why they shouldn't go to New Jersey. And so my point is that sometimes when you read those papers, they specifically will say in certain locations, oh, if you're in Texas, you don't want to go to Chicago. Why are they saying that? Because so many Black folks are actually going to Chicago, right? So sometimes you can actually discern some of those trends for the origin location of where are people going. And sometimes, especially when you look at some of like the gossip columns and things, where they would say, oh, such and such up in Cincinnati has gotten married, or such and such in Kansas City has died, or what have you. You start to see those trends over time in the newspapers, and they'll sometimes get very specific, not only about the state, but sometimes the cities where people are going. And even in doing that, if you're looking for people, you can kind of follow those trends and those train lines. I always try to remind folks how important those train lines were to try to find your people and where they were at and where they were coming from, and vice versa.
Absolutely. And of course, remember, as we framed the conversation early on, additional reasons for leaving were seminal events like Red Summer, right? military, right? Lynchings. Remember, some of these things are not going to be reflected on paper. Don't assume that the newspaper covered every lynching or every act of racial aggression that happened in your ancestral location. Some of it may only be committed to memory of living people, right? That doesn't mean that we don't still document it and that we don't still try to see if we can verify or find pieces of it. It just means that we're the custodian. Instead of it being family search or ancestry, we are the custodian. Where's your database? How well oiled and how put together is your system? Or are you going to get hacked like Parler with 99% of your data out there available for geo-positioning and whatnot? Yes, I did. I did, because it's true. How raggedy are our projects? How raggedy is the project of whoever we're going to talk about? Ourselves, right? On current living history.
Right.
Things that are not always on a census or on these official documents. We really, really have to continue to think about this. We have a great map from Jacob Lawrence that we're going to share with you guys that we thought was probably one of the best representations of the migration routes. And, you know, we liked it because it was moving, because it seemed to us like a lot of the scholarship on this is very dated. There are not a lot of people who are studying this. I think they feel like they've done everything, but I think a lot of it is missing. The other pieces we liked, in addition to just the major routes out, was the fact that they talk about the quote unquote reverse migration, right? The people who went back to their ancestral locations, maybe because it was cheaper, maybe because they were tired. There's a number of different reasons why people did that. So this is a great map to have. In addition to railway lines, you want to look at the major highway system, which is why the episode is named the way that it is. That tells you the interstates that people took if they drove back home or if they were going back to wherever they were living in the Midwest, right? You literally can look at the highway map and also see that. All right, so moving forward, the Great Migration experience, right? One of my favorite parts about it is what I call the transference of the family homestead, right? Where, you know, we kind of alluded to this tonight, where, you know, one person would set up shop, they get their place, right? And it's like, okay, I'm writing a letter back home because ain't nobody got no phone money, at least not then, right? So I'm writing a letter. James, come on, leave Dothan when you're ready, right? Put my stamp. Okay, you know, Pony Express carries it down. James gets it. Look, my sister Nika done wrote me. She done sent me $30 for train fare or whatever. There you go, James. And now I'm leaving this place, right? And so then James comes, I'm here, I'm with my husband, with my son, and James is a single man. He's single, ready to mingle in Chicago. And so he works with whatever job he can get because he can pick one up. Maybe he goes to Campbell Soup, and then James gets his place. But my spot is like Grand Central Station. Everybody migrates through my place. From my family, that is 3761 South Ellis in Chicago on the South Side. They literally there are like townhomes in that place right now. Nobody has lived at that address in my family for probably 50 plus years, but I know it because so many, literally death certificates, city directories, mail, letters, all the things you see with the same address, right? It's like Grand Central Station. Where was that for you all's families when it comes to these cities? True, you're muted.
For me,
Did you want to go first?
No, let James go.
Okay, go ahead.
I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just trying to make sure we didn't have dead air there. But no, for me, there were a couple relatives who were like that. One of whom was my Aunt Erlene. She was definitely one of those people who, you know, went north first and wrote back. Also, my great grandmother Aura. She was another one who, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier about these job trends, right? One of the things I was very surprised about, my grandma Aura passed a few years before I was born, but I didn't realize she worked as a domestic out like in the Hamptons in you know, in New York and whatnot. So she actually worked, I can't remember the name of the family right off the top of my head, but she worked for a very wealthy family. And the man of that family, the husband in that family actually was the mayor out in the Hamptons somewhere, you know. But because she had that job, that's what helped enable her to bring, you know, her children north from North Carolina and set them up actually, you know, pretty well by, you know, relatively for, you know, for a Black family at that time. So, you know, you just never know, you know, what you're gonna find, but you always find those pioneering relatives who were like you said, I like how you said Grand Central Station, like, you know, their home, their situation, they get there first, and then they start bringing everybody else up slowly but surely and getting them jobs. I mean, this is probably the worst comparison I can make. But when you think about the movie American Gangster, I'm sure there's another comparison I should have made, but when you think about that dynamic, that was a real thing.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? You want to talk about your Grand Central Station? And you know, and the other thing is, it doesn't necessarily have to be family, y'all, right? My grandmother, who she stayed with Nanny Mae. My mom says it just like Nanny Mae. She stayed with Nanny Mae, my godmother, and on the West Side. And that was the last time we stayed on the West Side. Like, you know, because in Chicago, if you stay on the West Side, it's like a West Side and South Side thing. They're real territorial. But you know, she stayed with her, and then my family in mass moved to 3761 South Ellis, and it was literally across the alleyway from each other. And then you start seeing again people moving in mass, because once those folks left that house, they bought a house. Then my grandmother moved in with her best friend because she bought a house, right? And so it didn't take long. And going back to restrictive covenants, my mother talked about how Black people couldn't buy homes on the West Side of Chicago when she was a kid. They couldn't, which is why so many Black folks are owners on the South Side, is because they would not sell to Black people. She talks about when they lived on Ellis, there was a white family that owned the building that they lived in. And as more Black people moved into that neighborhood, they built the fence up so you couldn't see there. And she said she couldn't believe that they stayed there that long. And she couldn't believe there were kids there, because she was like, how do we not know them little kids were there, right? And so when they would come out the house, they'd be like, they still live here? Like, it would be shocking, right? We talked about Black news, right? St. Louis has a paper. All these cities have Black papers, right? You need to learn where their archives are. And again, we shared some great examples tonight around how the Black press covered this time span. Remember the national Black papers like the Pittsburgh Courier, like the Chicago Defender, right? Where they are having, my favorite part of the dispatches, you know, about things like baptisms. Where you're like, are they really reporting on baptisms in Lake Providence, Louisiana? And they are. And my grandfather, his grandmother was the correspondent who would talk about the revival that would happen in Lake Providence. And she reported to the Chicago Defender. I screamed. I was like, really? This was a thing? But people they wanted news about what was going on, where their families were. Have you all ever seen any of these stories or clippings or notices in the paper, Linda?
I have one clipping where one of my ancestors went to Chicago and wrote back to Chickasaw County, Mississippi. So yeah, in the Chicago Defender, wish we had access to that paper, but yeah. I was also gonna say, when they migrated to St. Louis to stay with my grandma, they was at 909 North Jefferson Street. And so then you can see where they all kind of dispersed out and went to their own place. But the thing is, they all still stayed around each other. So when you can just look a few doors down or next door, and they were still there, just like they were back home. They lived in clusters.
That's a very important point. Carmen, did you find anything in the little one-liners in the paper?
I did. My grandmother was from Bonne Terre, Missouri, which is about maybe an hour or so south of St. Louis. Her family's been there forever. But I found in the same thing you said, Nika, in the St. Louis Argus, which is an old Black St. Louis newspaper, and they would have the reports from Festus and Bonne Terre and all those other Southeast Missouri cities, and it would say like, I found my great grandmother's engagement announcement. You know, Nellie Madison is going to marry, or Nellie Fulton's going to marry Rossi Madison. I was like, oh my God, it's just a line, but it just goes to show. And then it's like, well, this group of people all travel to St. Louis to visit so-and-so. And it was, at first I was like, this is so mundane. Like, why are they reporting on this? But I think it's what you said, Nika, that they were very proud to be reporting what was happening in these Black communities surrounding St. Louis and kind of putting it in the big newspaper. I think the correspondence sold subscriptions to the people in the little town. So that was their way to, support the paper. I think so. It was kind of like Black folks supporting the Black newspaper. And at first I was like, this is really weird to be in a newspaper, but I actually came to be very thankful for that, because it also would show who my ancestors were friends with and who they did church bakeries with and all these random things that, like you said, I wouldn't necessarily know in a history book or whatever. But thank God for Maud Townsend reporting on Bon Terre, Missouri, because now I know the mundane weekly activities of my ancestors.
Alex?
Yeah, I wanted to, Carmen spoke on a lot. With those newspapers, one thing that it really does help is help us contextualize is who they were associating with when they went to some of these new places. And I think that's so powerful and important. And then another thing is also thinking about safety. So, like the travel announcements between some of these towns, or it would say, Mr. or Sister so-and-so from, Second Mount Zion Baptist Church in Owasso, Alabama, went up to Cincinnati this weekend to visit Reverend Fuller and, whatever. It also let people, be on the lookout for them in case they pass through those towns. And then also if they did not come back, or if there was some kind of gap in communication, which happened, and that would alarm everybody. So I have a story similar to that where my grandma Maxine, was leaving Owasso to go see her folks in Cincinnati. And anyways, they were waiting for that Greyhound for her to come into town. And apparently the Greyhound had broken down in one of the cities on the way, but luckily she was traveling with her cousin, who had from her cousin's dad's side had relatives around, and they were able to write and say that, Maxine Palmore and Helen are, here visiting relatives until they can make their way up to Cincinnati. And that was like, when I found that, and I literally found it on newspaper.com, literally saying, exactly that. And yeah, that was pretty much my only comment on that.
Well, and something else too, because, can we get on current generations? Why are you posting all your business on Facebook? Well, again, if you don't make it to your location, we got to juxtapose this with our current environment right now, right? If somebody doesn't make it where they're supposed to get, right? The other thing, we also have to look at this as a double-edged sword. Just as you were alerting the folks in the location that you were supposed to get there, you're also sending out a signal to white folks who might be trying to look for you where you were going, right? So again, right? Come on now, let's call a thing, right? Isn't that what Iyanla says? Let's call a thing. So of course, as a result of this, we have an emergence of Black culture, right? As American pop culture, right? Number one, of course, you think music, you think Motown, you think Detroit, right? Those people are transplants for the most part, right? Like they're not native to, Michigan, and same thing with arts and with sports, right? And then, we've talked about tonight vacations to the family homestead. And it often makes me think of my mom being the city kid going down to Louisiana and not knowing how to use the outhouse and being made fun of because she had to be countryized when she came down there. Her cousins making her ride on the pig and, telling her to get away from the bar, because there were snakes over there, and, her being scared of everything and them falling out laughing at their cousin that was scared, And so again, it's like this repatriation, just like Alex talks about, or James talks about, going back down home, right? I didn't have the experience of going back down home until I was grown, because back home for us, from me being in California, was Chicago, right? It wasn't, granted, it sort of was Lake Providence, but for the most part, it wasn't, because our roots that were in Chicago were pretty deep. Did anyone else besides James and Alex have experiences doing that repatriation visit? You being the city kid, fish out of water in the country.
Mine was city to northern, upper Michigan, not south. So I had a different experience, but I wanted to comment back about talking about the community. I was excited back when one of the, what was it? The International Black Genealogy Summit was in Fort Wayne. Now, my folks had left out of Loudon, Tennessee and go to Fort Wayne, right? And there was a gentleman from 1917, I think it was, to like 1935 in the Black community, not far from where we all go to Allen County Public Library. It was a Black community right by there. But there was a gentleman there, and I think his name was Mr. Wingfield. He journaled every night. And Kurt and them at the library, the last time we were there for Maggie, they brought out one of the journals because they were in, copying them, and because they're all handwritten. And the day my dad, or the evening my dad was born, November 24th, 1924, Mr. Wingfield had said, they done had another baby, talking about my dad, my grandparents had another baby. And then another entry talked about my grandfather delivering coal, and that he felt so bad for him because they had so many kids, he gave him an extra quarter. And so he is telling the stories of everything that happened in the Black community from 1917 to 1933. And all those books just were donated to Allen County Public Library. So they have them, but they're transcribing all of them. And think about the history of everything that happened in the community. Who was visiting, who was dying, what kind of job they was doing. And it's a gold mine for people that have roots there. And I think it's kind of unusual, but we can always find somebody in that community that knows something. And it might be the little old librarian. So don't forget to tap into that local history down there, because I know Nika always focuses on talking about community research. I teared up when I saw these books, and I thought, oh my God, I could track every birth of my uncles and aunts and everything and what was going on in the Black community. So you never know who could be in there.
Well, and that further goes to the point of not considering the Black source
it was totally
to be
Black,
illegitimate, right?
Yes.
Because this is a literate Black man who is writing, journaling daily, right? Who has these accounts. And again, can you go back and ask your grandparents about that?
I didn't have any to know. Only my grandmother and my mother. Everybody died prior to 1952.
That's my point. So now you're having to rely on the account of somebody who had enough forethought, or even it was a part of their processing journey to write about your ancestors. And again, a lot of these things, like Shelley, we saw the books because we went to Allen County Public Library. We saw them in person, right? Do you know who's written diaries, who is Black from your area, or who was from maybe your ancestral area and ended up in a different location, right? Have they been interviewed by outfits like History Makers, right? Who has a huge catalog of interviews. Literally, I remember I was on History Makers website and I typed in Lake Providence. I was so shocked at how many people talked about Lake Providence in in these History Maker interviews. I was like, they have a time like Providence? Have you searched for Brownsville? Have you searched for Conecuh? Have you searched for Chickasaw County, Mississippi? Have you searched for Bullitt County? You know what I mean? I'm naming all y'all places. Have you searched for these places to see who diaried? We can't assume that Black folks didn't document their stories because we're looking in newspaper articles with us documenting ourselves. Our news was not mundane because as much as we're looking at it talking about Carmen flipped her hair left Tuesday, right? For us, that's boring. But for Black folks, we never got that mundane because we were relegated to the Negro news section on page 3 on the back, right? So again, search around, maybe even for search terms like diaries, personal papers. Don't have it have to
Society
be
news, somebody editing.
Yes, like all of those things. And so we getting ready to get into a real deep conversation because we have to talk about the shift in definition of Blackness as a result of this migration, because there was. Right? We're talking about class shifts where in the migrationary generation, we had people who maybe they own their land down south, maybe they sold it before they left, or maybe they have somebody working it. And, that's money. They're making money. They buy a house, class shifts, right? Different set of life circumstances than they had before they moved, right? Or maybe language shifts. They don't sound like they're from the country anymore, right? And then you have other things like how code switching becomes a thing and respectability becomes a thing, right? Let's qualify this conversation based on an article that was shared or was published in the Chicago Defender. And it literally is a set of do's and don'ts for people who are participating in the Great Migration. Note the date, 1919 is when you're seeing this, you all, right? And at the bottom of this, we call attention to some things which should be observed by our people. Don't use vile language in public places. Don't act discourteously to other people in public places. Don't allow yourself to be drawn into street brawls, Carmen. Don't use liberty as a license to do as you please, true. Don't take part of lawbreakers, be they men, women, or children, true. Don't make yourself a public nuisance, James. Don't encourage gamblers, disreputable men or women to ply their business at any time or any place, Alex. Don't congregate in crowds on the streets to the disadvantage of others passing along, Linda. Don't spend your time hanging around saloon doors or pool rooms. Don't live in insanitary houses or sleep in rooms without proper ventilation. Don't violate city ordinances relative to health conditions. Think about this, you guys. There's a ton of overcrowding because the housing can't hold everybody that is coming, which means that people are double and tripling up. There was even a point where people refused to rent to folks with children. Come on now. How do I know this? Because that's why my father was raised by his grandparents, because people wouldn't rent to a young couple with 2 young children, but they would rent to 2 older folks with a child, right? Lord. Oh, don't violate city ordinances relative to health conditions. Don't allow children to beg on the streets. Don't allow boys to steal from or assault peddlers going their rounds during the day. Don't be a beer can rusher or permit children to do such service. Don't abuse or violate the confidence of those who gave you employment. Don't leave your job when you have a few dollars in your pocket. Don't work for less wages than being paid people doing the same kind of work. Don't be made a tool or a strikebreaker for any corporation or firm. Don't allow buffet flats or rooms rented with privileges to be conducted in your neighborhood. Don't allow children under 15 years of age to run the streets after 9 p.m. Don't get intoxicated and go out on the street insulting women and children and make a beast of yourself. Someone may act likewise with your wife and children. Don't undermine other people by taking from their work. Don't appear on the street with old dust caps, dirty aprons, and raggedy clothes.
We need to bring some of these back now. Come on.
We're about to have a conversation on Shelley. Hold on, let me finish reading them. Let the beer can crusher, honey. This is like a kill kitty cat conference, honey. We getting all the terms tonight. Okay. Don't appear on the street with old dust caps, dirty aprons, and raggedy clothes. Lord, I love it. Don't throw garbage in the backyard or alley or keep dirty front yards. Don't attempt to make an express wagon or of streetcars. Don't forget, streetcar conductors are bound by rules the car company, which the law compels them to obey. And lastly, don't oppose police officers in discharge of their duty. You should be the one to assist in keeping peace.
I literally feel like we can have a conversation about that article and as the cause, and some of those don'ts as hip hop as being the effect of some of those causes. I literally feel like there's like a whole dissertation right.
There's a whole thing, because think about it, right? This was to keep you from getting killed, right? This is the Great Migration version of respectability, right? Because just as Shelley alluded to earlier with the seeing the family members step off the sidewalk as the white people pass by, this was survival. Okay. And so, I'm sure the defender at the time really thought that they were doing a service to the people by telling them about the beer can crushers and don't be cussing out on the street. But you guys have to remember, there was a culturing that had to happen once you left these Deep South locations, right? You couldn't be down there talking Creole with them folks. You can't even doing the dozens. That's embarrassing us, right? Because I left that life behind. That's not what I know anymore. You're bringing bad attention to us because they're going to think we're all like that, right? because you've allowed yourself to be othered. Come on now. People have made this a full-on grift right now. Candace Owens, right? We can keep going on and on and on and on about how respectability is now a grift amongst Black people. But it didn't start with her. It started as a result of us leaving these ancestral locations and this whole thought process that we would be accepted if we just acted right. So floor is open. Let's talk about it.
Well, I just have one comment. And again, born and raised in Michigan, deep roots there, the rest of the roots, Virginia, New England and stuff. But one of the things I will say growing up in the 50s, we knew how to stay in our place. And that's all I got to say. And all those folks that were migrating up had to learn about staying in their place once they got up there. But there was a difference from the North and the South. We stayed in our place.
I would not qualify it as a difference based on what my mother.
Depends on where you're
lengthy,
at. I wasn't in a big city like Chicago.
I was about to say Chicago is the most segregated
Detroit
city in the country
might have had it
to this day.
More than Grand Rapids.
And I asked her flat out, I said, and here's the thing, you guys, my mother went to an integrated high school. My mother went to school with Black kids, white kids, Asian kids, Latino kids, right? My mother had Black teachers, white teachers. This is in Chicago because the school she went to was part of the University of Chicago. The people who worked at that institution, their kids went to the schools that my mom went to. My grandmother moved over to this neighborhood. But despite her being in close proximity like that with white folks, my mother did not deal with white people at all. Mm-hmm. So the whole thought process that we've emerged and this is, Hyde Park is such a great experiment because of blah, blah, blah. That didn't mean that there was enough acting that she could do. She couldn't stop being a beer crusher. She couldn't live in a ventilated property. She was still perceptibly Black and she wasn't wealthy, right? And so again, we have to really divorce ourselves from the notion of allowing ourselves to be othered. Because a lot of us are feeling some pain right now around the fact that we have allowed people in our lives to other us as Black people, and the chickens are coming home to roost. Because now it's, you're no longer a other anymore. You've been lumped in with all the other Black people. Alex, what would you like to say?
I really can't follow up with you on that part because you just dropped a lot of mics. But I was saying that genealogically speaking, so even that, like thinking about what led up to the defender printing that list of do's and don'ts, it makes me think about what led up to it. So all of those things would have been incidents that probably were reported. You could also probably find evidence of them in the same papers or in the white papers, particularly because, they love to criminalize the Black youths. But then also you can find in records for your research, like there's plenty of cases where so-and-so was drunk and, at Lafayette and Union Avenue and, exposed himself to Mrs. So-and-so. And then there's a case on that, and that's a record trail, right? So all of those things would have been, genealogically speaking, things that probably already happened. I can imagine the conversation, and they out here letting the kids stay out past 9, and they letting them be beer can pushers, whatever that is, and they letting them, all that kind of stuff. They wearing them raggedy ass clothes, and you see sister so-and-so, sister came up here from Mississippi, her raggedy ass can dress her kids better than that. It's trifling. I know what conversation happens. You know how our people are. But all that being said, also there's record of it somewhere. I am certain.
Man, oh man, James.
That reminded me. So I saw a story in the newspaper one time from looking in a dozen paper talking about two men weren't related to me who had gone to New Jersey. And I don't know who these brothers were, but apparently they had some rivalry from when they was teenagers or something, and they both had migrated up to Newark, and somehow they bumped into each other on the streets and got to fighting. Somebody pulled a knife out, somebody had a pistol, and the police got involved, and they both ended up going to jail. And of course, in the newspaper, they said them two, everybody around here knows that them two never got along, and now they done went up there up north and embarrassed the whole Black community of Dothan, Alabama. I mean, you see these type of stories, and you have to think, on the one hand, I don't do respectability politics. I always tell people that. But one of the reasons why I don't is because we were subjected to those type of things. It's like, it can't just be two men, just they have a problem. It's a reflection on all of us, especially because now y'all done took y'all mess. It was one thing when y'all was doing it down here at home. Now y'all done took y'all mess up there to the north with all of the big newspapers and all of the, and I'm sure nobody else was really paying attention to them, but that's how it's perceived, right? So hence that article in the Defender.
You're absolutely right. And yeah, this is, again, especially when you start talking about racial components, you're also bringing in the class warfare when it comes to the collision of new immigrants coming over from Europe, right? And them migrating along with our folks migrating, and then competing for jobs, competing for housing, the different perceptions. You think about the race riot in Chicago and how that all started as a result of racial strife between Black people and European immigrants, right? And so, it's just, again, you're compressed for space, you're compressed for resources, right? You don't have housing. You might have a job, but it's like you got to rent a room and y'all in there with 75 other people. You know what I mean? Or you haven't found a job yet. Maybe you are the beer can rusher. You know what I mean? It's a lot of different stuff. Additionally, so we can move forward, because we got to talk about the experience at the homestead briefly before we roll into Ask Mariah. We talked about photos and people taking the brother, we made it picture when they got to the places. I think we all have them with the backdrops, and they're like, it's like, hey, look, I'm here, I made it. Right. So definitely look for those clues, those context clues amongst your family stuff, right? Because they're probably there. And here's the thing, your folks may have sent pictures back to somebody who's at the ancestral location, and you just might not have the copies of it with you, but they may have it there. That's a picture. A picture of my cousin posing in front of his car. Yes, all of the extra. I have a set of photos. It's my grandmother and her siblings and their mom. And I don't know why my great grandmother has on a fur coat and my grandmother got on a dress that's got short sleeves. Was it hot or cold, y'all? Or was it a flex? I don't understand. But again, right? Everybody's dressed
Maybe
up.
she just arrived from the north going to the south or something.
Maybe they were in Kansas City. It didn't make any sense. Why
it gets cold in Kansas City.
My grandmother was like 9 with like a short sleeve shirt on or like dress. I don't get it, but again, it's one of those situations. And then of course we get to talk about racial oppression, right? We talked about that, right? Ohio, they didn't have the separation of races on the books, but they had segregated schools, right? Because of redlining, you have all the kids of one race end up packed into this one particular area so that all the schools are Black, right? Or all the schools are white, right? So in essence, while it may not have been, legislatively Jim Crow, socially it was, right? Because again, people didn't mix. They didn't do any of the things that people automatically assume just because it's the North that happened. Of course, you have offshoots like, the emergence of urban planning because of the fact that these people didn't have a place to go and making sure that they had adequate housing, right? And the fact that this is not just one place, as we've talked to earlier. People went to more than one city, right? So as Shelley's folks left from Tennessee, they went to Indiana. And of course, after a lynching that happened there, they ended up in Michigan. My family went from Louisiana to Chicago, then to California, right? Sometimes there's more than one location. So don't assume that your folks ended up in where they ended up was the last place. There could have been a stop before that maybe folks are forgetting to mention, or you just haven't unearthed that yet. And then the other piece of when the people die, the body getting shipped back home so they can be buried in the ancestral cemetery, right? So there still is a whole lot of ties to a lot of this forward. Let's talk about what happened to the folks to the family homesteads, right? You have loss of membership because all of your people in your religious organizations and in your social organizations have left, right? So you start to see organizations evaporate because all of the people who were doing the work or who were members have left, right? Then you see new organizations and new systems start to pop up. Of course, we talked about the ruling class of families, right? And the fact that they gain more of a stronghold because there's not enough people there to fight them off, or to provide other options. And then you have, in terms of, I talked about the city kids getting countrified. You have the country kids having to learn the city when they go to visit their family in the north. I have a story. My cousin stayed in Chicago one night, and she went back to Lake Providence. It was too much. Chicago was too much for her. She could not, it was too loud. She couldn't handle it. And again, we also have the emergence of the civil rights movement, right? Largely based on the people who were still in the South. Let's talk about that, right? It did require northern assistance, but a lot of that was because we ain't gonna deal with this no more. We don't want to leave. We need to be equitable, right? So let's close out by having a conversation around the aftermath, right? Because we've talked about the background, we've talked about the experience. Let's talk about the aftermath. Is there a paradox that it was just all we gained was success by migrating out? Do you guys think that? Go ahead, Alex, because you the first one emoting with your face.
Oh, sorry. I didn't even know that y'all could see. No, these places, these great migration places are, I say this all the time, a whole wasteland. We got red lines, we got, water poisoning in the paint, poison, just poison. And when we really start to process it,
Never trust a big city and a smile. You said poison.
Honestly,
I had to get you.
And it's also, I think that, people, when you really start tracing, like, I know that, this next year we got the 1950 census coming out, and people are going to start feeling like, especially folks that are like going to be starting research, they're going to be seeing their ancestors in these great migration cities and really starting to identify more closely with some of these great migration places instead of like those old home places. But I think that when you start following through the second half of the century and up to the present, you start seeing that the most mayhem in this country, especially in recent history, has happened in where? These great migration wastelands, the most miseducation in these great migration wastelands, the places that people are experiencing gentrification the most, red lines communities in great migration, wastelands. So when we really start to think about that, I don't think that like much was really gained in the long run, because there's hardly a last holdout for our people in these places. You got the Harlems, you got the South Side of Chicago, you got the Detroits, but what's happening there? You know what I mean? What do we really have to show for it, other than the culture that we've produced for this whole country, in the arts and the material culture? But what do we really have to show, other than the fact that like they still killing us in them same old cities, right? So that's my piece. Wastelands.
Wastelands and poison. Any other?
I don't know if I, and maybe I'm a little defensive, but I don't know if I would say wastelands. I do think that there's definitely a conversation to be had about, especially when you read the material like what we've talked about tonight, right? There is definitely a conversation to be had about what would America be like politically, economically, and otherwise. What would Black America be like had we stayed primarily concentrated in the Deep South, in the former Confederacy, right? Maybe Georgia would have been blue sooner, right? Who knows? But I think that there's a really mixed bag, because on the one hand, you do see a lot of economic inequality and whatnot in the cities and whatnot. But then on the other hand, I mean, for a lot of us, myself included, I mean, we have people who were fleeing we were fleeing apartheid, okay? So I think it's a really mixed bag. And for us of today, I don't know that I would have made a different decision back in those days. But again, it depends on who you were also. Earlier we were talking about home ownership, right? If you've got a bunch of property down in Mississippi somewhere in your family, you might be less inclined to leave. But if you ain't really got nothing going on in terms of land ownership or job opportunities, et cetera, you got the KKK and that means the Ku Klux Klan and the Crooked Cock Crew, either one, same thing. You've got all of that going on. You might want to move out to a little small, wonderful community like Compton, California. You might just take your chance just to see,
And quiet
and I
as
do
it's
think
kept,
it's interesting.
quiet as it's kept, Compton was white. Compton was
Right.
white,
Exactly.
and Compton became Black, and now Compton is Latino.
Exactly. And I do think that there is, to Alex's point though, I do think that there is a sense of justice in a way, in terms of, yes, we did leave for a generation or two or three or what have you, but I know over the course of my lifetime, I know plenty of people who decided to say, forget these New Jersey taxes, and went back to Atlanta or moved down to Atlanta, which I don't know what it is about Atlanta. Black folks move there and think all the problems get solved.
It was the 90s.
That's another episode.
It was Freaknik. It was the 90s. I mean, Freaknik was the best recruiting tool to get people into Atlanta. I wish somebody fight me. That's a hill I'm going to die on.
Can we
Freaknik
talk
is the
about the
reason why.
genealogy? Can we talk about genealogy? Finding pictures of their parents and grandparents at Freaknik?
Yes, 1995.
Right.
Oh, I'm moving down here. Yeah, right. Like you already
right.
know. That's what happened.
Hey, when I left Korea, I
any
said,
of y'all at Freaknik.
yeah.
If I see any of y'all
I
at
don't know
Freaknik,
about no video, but I got some pictures. But when I left Korea, I told the Army, I don't care where y'all put me in Georgia, just send me there. I ain't care. But guess what? I got Fort Stewart. And I was there in 95.
I'm telling you, Freaknik was the best recruiting tool for Atlanta. Y'all, this is a hill I'm willing to die on.
Yeah.
I'm willing to die on this hill.
Even the athletes went there and set up shop.
Look, people are in the chat. People are in the chat room saying when they went to Freaknik. So we know our viewers. We know our viewers. We know our demographic.
Go back about 15 seconds and get the screenshot of me and Alex in our faces, because true. Anyway, moving genealogy.
Going back to the conversation. So, but still, I think this is a good conversation to have, right? Because we often place our thought process now on what choices we would have made then, right? And a lot of us, I mean, I think I can say for the most part, I think a lot of us come from families who were owning land in our ancestral locations and still made the choice to leave, right? So even that land ownership, really, we can't even say that would have made us stay, right? And as a result of that, you guys, you also think about the fact that when people up and leave, unless they made the conscious choice to sell their land upon leaving, then you have these situations that bubble up years later through estates, because people just leave and it's out of sight, out of mind, where you have 155 people who were heirs to 5 acres. And it's like me and Karma gonna be standing next to you. Oh girl, this is my 0.00257, and that's your 0.30258. Like literally the clerks in these offices, you all have to divvy this land up like this. I've seen it. I've been at the courthouse when Miss B has to do it. And she goes, and she'll be like, oh girl, they didn't do a succession. And the daddy died about 40 years ago. And then now we got to sit up there and divide 12 acres between 300 people. And I was like, what? You saw it was prevalent after Katrina, when people didn't get the deeds and the titles transferred to the children's names, and the homes were in the names of the parents. So then when they decided to go and do renovations to bring the house back, it was a bunch of red tape, because who really owned it? And then having to get all those people to sign off on that kind of stuff. Again, it's the same thing with cemeteries, right? And how the cemeteries get abandoned and there's no one to take care of them, no custodians of them, right? And so then you have this huge amount of land loss. We have a bunch of articles that have been talking about this. This has been a topic that's been in the media for the last 2 or 3 years, probably even longer. Even Duke University has a study on Black land loss, right? And Alex brought this up, and this is a great point around, the aftermath, right? And the current protest movement we're seeing. And how, it literally is a sort of revival of what we saw happening in southern cities during the civil rights movement. It's now shifted north and west, right? It's not isolated to the South, because the children who are the descendants of Jim Crow are now on the receiving end of Jim Crow, and its northern and its western and its northeastern iterations, right? So naturally, of course, the grandchildren of these people would be speaking up. Naturally, they will be protesting, because now you've made their safe location into the one that they left, right? And so again, here's the call to action. What can you add to the story by doing a deep dive into your family's specific chapter of this collective history around the migration? What can you add to that? Is it a matter of interviewing, relatives? Is it reading scholarship? Right? One of the studies we pulled for this episode was incredible, talking about the gains that the second generation made after the first one who migrated, and how literally, if you are Black and you went from one southern city to another, your life expectancy dropped, you made less money, you had, again, just a change in location improves your life expectancy and your earning potential. That's crazy. And how even when you look at Southern whites who migrated during this time span, Black folks outperformed them. So what are we doing as the beneficiaries of this experience, right? What are some goals you guys have before we move into Ask Mariah?
I really think it's about bringing those lives and stories to life and giving them. We don't have it all. We don't know it all. We only get what we hear or get exposed to. And not only when you're talking about, with that article talked about that second generation going, you gotta say something about the mental capacity from going from one place to another. And I think that's huge. And what do you bring with you, from whatever happened to you, I'm going to say in the South, and then you go into the North or Midwest, whatever it is. But I think the mental capacity made you or broke you once you got there and where you were going. Yeah, you had opportunity, but you also had a little bit of opportunity still in the South. But the culture and that mentality was totally different. Somebody else might see it differently, but when I read that article, I immediately went to the mental capacity of the people's movement, and to track that, I'd like to tell that story. Why did they leave Knoxville, Tennessee or Loudon, Tennessee and go to Fort Wayne and end up and you're a janitor or you're digging coal at the hotel? Is that better? I don't know. The wages would have been higher, definitely. But again, that mental thing, I think is got a value to it.
Anyone else? What are some things you're going to do going forward? I know I need to have way more follow-up conversations with my mom about her experience in Chicago. And I think for me, one of the most telling things was, when she got a job at Clorox, and the fact that it was in Cicero and Black people didn't live there. And so what she had to endure, literally riding the bus and having to walk to work every day. And the fact that she knew that if she stayed there after dark, she was as good as dead, right? And this is in Chicago. This is not in, Wewoka, Oklahoma, or I'm just making up some place. This isn't, you know what I'm saying? This is not a location you're supposed to be. This is in Chicago. And there are still places like this. Think back to those videos we've seen online. There's that one of the kids, and I want to say it's in Long Island, that was on PBS, where it's these Black girls, and they were in this community, and these kids were literally shouting the N-word at them. And again, it's time for us to catalog these stories and these experiences. And, for me, it's just about having conversations with my mom, other family members who left, and getting that stuff down on paper for our own, again, make it your repository. Carmen?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that. One thing that I've noticed about, as we're having this conversation about the Great Migration, is how some counties that, like, especially in Southeast Missouri, where my grandmother's people are from, after like all the Black folks left out, it kind of becomes not very friendly to Black people who need to research there, but they have so many records, like from the slavery era when all my ancestors were there like 200 years ago. And so, and when I reach out to the library or stuff, they have it and they send it to me and stuff like that. But it's interesting to me how this is where my family was for generations. And now I have concerns about my physical safety going there when I should be feeling like, oh, I can go down there. It's just an hour or so south off of 55, but my goal is to go back there or to be committed to trying to get as much as I can from those places and maybe try to get over some of my own apprehension about it, because there's too much richness there that concerns my family and the other Black folks that worked in the lead mines and lived in that area for like hundreds of years, to just leave it there to not be discovered just because everybody left in the migration. Like they came to St. Louis, they went to Chicago, they went to Gary, all those other places. And so there's not really a lot of us there anymore. And it's painful, honestly.
James?
For me, I definitely receive what Carmen said, but for me, I would say I want to be a little more intentional about not just interviewing people, but also trying to interview elders in small groups to have conversations, which is something I don't know that a ton of people do. I know I haven't. But I really want to kind of capture not just an individual story, but also to have people have those discussions. And even sometimes people will remind each other of things, or even if they get into an argument or what have you. In particular, I'm thinking about my, I have a set of great aunts that all, some of them that live here in my area, and just to sit down with them together and have them talk and reflect about why did they leave, Southern Virginia, and who left when and what happened, et cetera, et cetera. I definitely want to do that, because this great migration history, as we were saying, is very important. And this is something that the scholars and all the people, I like what Nika said earlier, all these websites and whatnot, those are not going to be the repositories where you will find that information. We are the repository. Our families, your grandparents, your parents, et cetera, if you're still living, even if they're not, you have a lot of the material, probably you have access to some of it. We need to be documenting it in a systematic way.
Again, you do not have to be Isabel Wilkerson, and you don't have to rely on Isabel Wilkerson or someone else. Not taking anything away from Sis, because her work is incredible, but be empowered, again, to not feel like you have to have a major book deal or that you have to be a part of a major university in order for you to study your own family. You have already been conducting your own study. Right. That's what this is. It's a study. You've already been conducting this. So add a little bit, add more depth to it. Especially, again, you guys, a lot of the stuff that we could search out to find for this time span, we're not going to get access to that stuff until years from now. Mm-hmm. So it's so much better for us to be doing the work now to get those oral history down, so that way, when it does come out, we can step forward. Linda, what's your going forward?
My going forward is going to be imperative that I reach out to my family members that are still alive and living down, that didn't migrate out or either went back, because we're in a time now where we are living or adapting to a new normal. So time is of the essence, and not to procrastinate, but get those stories down. That's a gap. This whole conversation around migration lets me know there's still a gap in my research.
Alex?
One of the biggest things that I want to focus on is that, in these migration cities, even though until the day I die, will refer to them as wastelands, the communities that Black people created and were forced into also are thriving, bustling places full of history. So outside of our own families and our own family's migration story, that neighbor that lived next door probably remembered when your great-great-grand Roach came up from Mississippi and in Alabama. And she said, oh, I remember when Shirley and them first moved in, but that school kind of got them bad kids together, or whatever they got to say. So I'm just trying to keep it light to stay awake, y'all. But nonetheless, focusing on those communities is also a big priority. I'm from the West Coast. I'm fourth generation Bay Area, technically at this point. And like when I walk through West Oakland now, when I see how many of our folks are, hanging on by a thread, but can recall, when that store was out over there, when Pops's barbershop was down the street, when they had the sideshow down there, whatever the case is, those are also stories that we need to be constantly documenting. And it doesn't always have to be, two generations above. It could be people that are children and grandchildren of the migration too, that remembers, oh, well, I remember my granddad they used to say he lived over there, or they used to say he, would play dice on the corner down there with, so-and-so granddaddy, or whatever the case is. Those are stories that we need to document, even if there's no record, no physical record of it. So thinking about that in all these communities is very important. And then also thinking about the actual documented history as well is also important. If you notice that there is a high school or some kind of middle school in your Great Migration hub, that the yearbooks or whatever are not on Ancestry, connect with that high school and see if you guys can start some kind of initiative to digitize those. See if there's like some alumni association or whatever, because those are where so many people will also have tons of memories and tons of stories to share and go off of. And when we really think about, especially in our broader research with our DNA matches or distant cousins or whoever who also went off to these places, where we start seeing that gap because people are too young on the record or whatever, or born too recent and we can't find documentation back, that's one way to get past some of that, more recent history brick wall. So that's what I also am focusing on, or goals that I have too.
True, you're the last one, then we're going to roll into Ask Mariah.
I'm good. I'm just with you on everything. Make it something that's tangible and that it's not just with you. Get this out to your young folks, mentor the children in your family so that they can get where you're going and take it even further. I always say my blog and my documentary is the gift that keeps on giving, but there's still even more I have to do. But I'm just looking forward to the archives coming out with stuff. Alabama, I think it's going to be coming out with some exciting stuff about our people and records down there. So, like Alex said, just reach out to your community. There's so much more that you can do, but you have to start talking to these family members in that time period to get that first hand resource, that first account. So that it's not, your second or your third, or, it's secondhand, or it was or was not. So I recommend doing that. Take your chances. With Carmen, she says she's hesitant. I was in that same position, but I just went on down there and did what I had to do. Don't let that stop you. A lot of things I did early in my genealogy work was out of fear, but here it is 2021, and look at everything I have to go back on. I'm still even doing daddy's letters from migration period. That's what these all are right here. And just keep on keeping on.
Well, and again, you have a record that Carmen decided to go to Valhalla, wherever she said.
Right.
so she don't come back.
I'm just saying,
that's what I'm saying. If she don't come back, then we have a record, right?
Yeah.
So, oh my gosh. Well, of course, tonight
Mariah.
we have an Ask Mariah. And of course, we have to remind everybody that Mariah is named after our dear friend, Vicki Davis Mitchell's ancestor that was so elusive. So I've thrown around the idea of maybe changing the name to Ask Vicki, because Vicki is talking to Mariah now and she's getting all of her answers. So now we have to ask Vicki. So this is your favorite part of the show, where you, the viewer, submit your questions, queries, conundrums, and more to the panel. And we weigh in live with research help specifically geared towards you. Panelists never see the queries beforehand, so you get a chance to see us work together live to help our Genia Buzz get past their brick walls. All right, tonight's query is from Lee Jaber, or Jabber. I want to say it's Jaber, Haber, not sure. All right. Question: what is Lucinda's maiden name and who is her mother? Her name is Lucinda Floyd on the 1870 census in Elmore County, Alabama, and her husband's name was Ben Floyd. So we're looking for Lucinda Floyd, we're looking for a maiden name, and also the name of her mother. She's listed as Lucinda Floyd on the 1870 census in Elmore County, Alabama. Husband was Ben Floyd. Kids listed on the 1870 census are Amy, Matilda, and Henderson. It says she was born in 1820 in South Carolina. And the 1880, her name was M.C. Floyd, which the M stands for Melinda, even though her name is Lucinda on 1870. How do we know that? We don't know that. What other proof do we have that it's her? All right. They have searched for death certificates for Lucinda and Ben, along with each child. No luck. They were informed that the neighbors gave the census taker information. Lucinda is their great-great-grandmother, and it was said that they were Native Americans who were reclassified as colored, Negro, mulatto, or Black in Alabama. Okay. So there's a question. Initially, there's one more slide just for the panelists. We're looking for people in Elmore County, Alabama. There's a question I have between this 1870 and this 1880 record. Also considering that the person we're talking about was born in 1820, which means that that person could have been dead by 1880, right? So how do we know MC and Lucinda are the same person? They said they look for death certificates. Well, these people were born before slavery ended, so they probably don't have them. Not in a state like Alabama in this particular location. So for the next slide, and we think we can back this information up of Indians being reclassified as Negroes in a book called Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. So there might be some truth to oral history, and that's always been her stance. She even wore the regalia all her life. Now, refocusing the conversation, it's not about proving that Lucinda is Native American. The initial query was around discovering her maiden name and the name of her mother. What say you, panel? What say you?
I think that I'm not going to say it's impossible to find the maiden name, but I do think you have to factor that part in about what Nika just said regarding the generation of people you're talking about. I mean, if you're born in 1820 and then you're thinking about not only do you have this barrier of slavery, which is not impossible to get past, right? I mean, I've done that myself. It's not impossible. But then here's the other thing that really I think is going to be the bigger problem in this case for this question, which is if a person is born in 1820 and you know that they're married in 1870, let's give you the 1880 record, right? If this couple got married in 1850, 1860, 67, right? Even if it wasn't legally recognized, right? This is where your issue can come in. Even if marriage wasn't legally recognized, by the time the paper trail starts on this couple, you may find a legal marriage acknowledged in some court records somewhere. It's very possible, and we can talk about that. But there is a possibility that in this person's legally documented life, that her maiden name may not be there. And it could be, and we can definitely talk about that. But I do want to prep you for that possibility. Especially in Alabama, and I know Alabama. I know True's on here too. I know Alabama stuff. You may find it, but there's a chance it may not be there.
I'll just make a comment, but not just with what James is saying. I research a lot of first name only, and I don't have a last name in some of the research that I do for my job. And you are absolutely right. And the names change. Also, as locations change, the name can change for whatever reason. So yeah, there's always, and I always like to say this in some of my presentations, one of the challenges that we could have is that we might never find this person. And again, because we got one name, The first name can change. Nika's question, Lucinda to Melinda. Something happened there, or the name change, or whatever. Or are we talking about two different people just because they might be up in the same household? But somehow we do know that what Lucretia, what's her name? Lucinda got to Ben and they got babies.
Yeah.
So
Well,
build from there is where I would go.
Yeah. And so based on, this is Elmore, 1870, and I think where they got the information about the 1880 was from Hints, because when you pop it out, it'll take you to this 1880.
Right.
And there is a child, it's the household with John Paschal and an MG who's 25, who I imagine is probably this Matilda. Potentially, because it matches up, and then you've got Ben and MC.
Yeah.
I would not. I just wouldn't assume that MC, unless there's some other document that they have that would say something else. The other thing is you can't assume that MC and Lucinda are the same person. Ben could have got with another woman who was around the same age as his previous wife. So I can't. How do we know definitively that MC and Lucinda are two different people or the same person?
Are
We
their
don't know that.
ages similar from
They're
70
the same
to 80?
age. Yeah, same
That's probably
age.
what they're going on, and birth locations. That probably is what they're going on.
But I mean, going back
once-
to
but it's not a good theory to hold on that you know.
no. And I think James's suggestion around looking for the marriage, even if it's a later one for them, right? Even though they're much older, because I think all of us have seen that where people were together during slavery and then they got officially married, like
Freedmen
after
Bureau.
slavery ended.
That might be the
Freedmen
first
Bureau.
document. Yeah.
Freedmen Bureau may be a way to find the maiden name. I would look into the neighborhood. Who were the people who were living around them, not just the white folks, but look at the Black folks. Do you start seeing names repeated? Even who this daughter marries, does Pascal, is that a name, a known name? Are there other Pascals who intermarried with this Floyd family? I would imagine that the resources and the time need to be focused more on that versus trying to prove that she was Native American. Right. Because that's futile in locations that aren't necessarily the most conducive to doing indigenous research. Anything else you guys want to add?
One more thing what I would do if I'm looking for the surname is, like you said, I would really be kind of more interested in looking at the children of this marriage, following them through their lives and seeing, can you find maybe a draft record or a marriage record or something where they're indicating who their parents are. That's something that I would be interested in doing. And then here's another thing that we can talk about as well, which is, have you mapped out the family of these other branches aside from your own? Because you may have a fourth or fifth cousin who's on Ancestry, who's on Facebook or whatever the case may be, and they may have some answers for you. They may have some documents or things. So that's another thing that I would be curious to know. On top of, if you decide to do DNA, of course, that's another thing. But have you mapped out the family branches of the other sides as much as you could? We don't know right now, but you would know.
I'd exhaust the search on Ben.
Yeah.
And hold up a little bit on Lucinda. Let's go for Ben and everybody around him. And those kids, thinking of when she was born and when they're born, there should be death certificates. I'm going to say that. Not necessarily because of where they're at, but she got to go. Don't go for the certificate, go for the grave and see if the cemeteries that are in the community, and stop looking for an actual document and just go to the cemeteries. It might even be find a grave, but it might be the Black churches or white church, whoever it is she's looking for. Go to the churches and look for the families and find out what faith, that money follow land and water to faith, the community, and start going that way. And I would flip to searching first name only or last name only in the locations and the locations around. So
Yeah, I
yeah.
think that's a good practice. I think also looking for Ben in records to see if it's Ben and wife
Yeah.
in deeds, right? This is local stuff.
Yeah.
Newspapers, especially with them being old, if they died before 1900, sometimes you get that coverage, old Negro slave dies, you know, those ridiculously patronizing articles, right? But they still catalog people. Civil War, Ben was a little old, but maybe one of their sons might have fought and she might have collected the pension, or maybe a witness in the pension, right? It's not all feudal, right? And again, sometimes for some of our ancestors, because they died before state mandated death certificates, that headstone is all you have. You know what I mean? How do we not know? Has she looked to see if Ben owned any property? Did Ben have a probate? Did she have a probate? Right? Any other suggestions? Because again, if you're trying to get to her mother's name, you're gonna, especially as researching women, you're gonna have to go through a lot of separate channels, right? And have you vetted all of those children? Instead of, I'll look for a death certificate. Have you traced them down, right? And their descendants. The other piece is DNA. Are you researching the right person? How do you know that this is the right person, right? How did you get back to her? Is it oral history? Is it a paper trail? Is it DNA? Is it all three, right?
And also, I would not, let me correct my English before I say this. I would not think about 1890 not being there, because that means you're not doing a deep dive in what you're supposed to be doing. Because go find that questionnaire. It was 1890, has a census questionnaire with 25 questions. Just go answer those questions between 1870, 1880, and jump into 1900 and 1910. If you can answer those questions, you ain't missing 1890. That's my word to the wise tonight. Is just go get the questionnaire from the census. We showed it during the 1850 and 60s, going through there, following what the enumerator was supposed to be doing, and go try to remake that. And that might
James?
help.
One thing I will tell you that you can do, if you go on Family Search and go into checking in these are unindexed records now, but there's several links of marriage records as well as probate and estate records on Family Search. Now these are unindexed, so you're gonna have to do some real deep digging. But I just did a real cursory search, just randomly clicked on something, and I'm looking at marriage record that what they were doing at one point was they weren't listing the full name of the individual bride and groom in the beginning of the book. They would say the surname of the bride and groom, apparently. So like right now I'm looking at one that said there was a Floyd that married a Ramsey. These may or may not be your people, these may be white people, I don't know, but go dig into some of these records on Family Search. And again, these are unindexed, and all I did was I just did a straight search by location. I put in Elmore County, Alabama. Boom. Congratulations. I just gave you something to do in the wee hours of the morning, like I was doing the other day, messing with Nika and Alex.
Wait a minute. Dante Eubanks needs to get kicked out of the chat room. Talking about, all right, cousin, auntie, Dr. Shelley Murphy from the Genealogy Baptist Workshop of America. He needs to stop.
My cousin Dante, look.
That's
look,
what I
so
told you, James. You got to pay attention to your homework.
No,
Dante and
no.
I connect, and you
Oh
ignoring
my
another
gosh.
factor who you connect to.
Oh my gosh. Well, there's some great suggestions in the
Yes.
chat room. People saying, look at trees,
The
see what you
fan,
can
too.
find. Right. Look at the fan club, look at the crew of the people who they're around, right? And who they maybe work with, industry, all of that kind of stuff. And again, this is one of those things. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. People think you have to do a straight shot for like DAR and SAR, right? Like it's got to be just your line. No, sometimes you have to hop around to different ancestors and different people in order for you to find your proof. So
Right.
until you've and again, this is community research.
Right.
This is how this works. Sometimes you have to look for other people to find your stuff. So it looks like your answer probably isn't digging in a lot of local records, in particular on Family Search. Any other suggestions before we wrap up for the evening? All right. Well, you too can get assistance for your genealogy research hurdles. If you need help with your family history research, be sure to submit to BlackProGen Live's Ask Mariah for a chance to have experts weigh in to help you get past your genealogy research hurdles. The link to submit is in the description of each and every episode of the show. Remember to be specific. Let us know what records you've searched, what oral history you have, if you've DNA tested, and more. The more you tell us, the better. You just may be selected to be featured on an upcoming episode. Coming up for BlackProGen Live, I don't know who that lady is. Who is that? I don't know who that is. I'm kidding. Do you have ancestors who lived near or around the University of Virginia? Those ancestors just may have been utilized as enslaved labor by the University of Virginia. Tune in as Dr. Shelley Murphy from the Genealogy Workshop of America. I'm kidding, but that literally is going to be
Put
your
the
title from
Baptist
now
in
on.
there since he's going to throw Baptist on, and I'm not a Baptist, so. But anyway,
it's like the gospel music workshop. That's what he's
Right.
doing.
I know.
You're going to show people how to identify if their ancestors were involved. Remember, this is a premiere of History Unscripted. It's going to be taking place on Tuesday, January 26th. Remember, this is not live, it's pre-recorded, but we will be there with you in the chat room to watch the episode. And you're going to learn a lot about what Shelley is doing at UVA. And it kicks off our community research spotlight series for History Unscripted. Of course, Crew Check is back. We had an amazing time for Coming to America. It was so much fun and so extra. We loved every minute of it. Our next crew chat is taking place on Tuesday, February 2nd. We're going to be talking about King T'Challa and Killmonger and all of the people from Black Panther. So don't forget to join us on Twitter for the next crew chat at 8 p.m. Central, Tuesday, February 2nd. And ooh, Lord, I can't wait till this episode. Jesus, February can't come soon enough. The concept of ex-slave pensions. Let me say that again. The concept of ex-slave pensions. Because see, this didn't score as high on the survey because I know y'all didn't know what we were talking about.
Exactly.
But that's all right, because you're going to learn today. The concept of ex-slave pensions gained traction in 1890 and became a full movement by the beginning of the 20th century. Learn about the history and demise of the movement, the leaders, and how to find ancestors among the records. Yes, there was an ex-slave pension movement. And if you don't know about it, or if you're just assuming your folks ain't involved, child, pull up a chair, pull up a seat, join us for episode 128, National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association, airing live on Wednesday. Can we say Wednesday? Wednesday, February 10th at 6 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern. I have to reiterate that because basketball season always throws off Tuesdays, the first couple episodes every year. So just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that. Anything else before we go? Chu, you want to say anything? Parting words? Anybody? Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you, panelists, even
I'll
those
say
who
one
left.
word. Can I say one word?
Yes, you can.
History was made today. Impeachment 2 times. That's all I got to say. I ain't saying nothing else.
Okay. Chu, anything you'd like to say?
I just want to thank everybody. Just make this your year for pivoting. Pivot on your research and your work. That's my key word. We got to pivot. We've got to move in another direction and get your genealogy going here. So that's what we'll be here for the next month and the month after that. That's what we're going to be here doing for you all. So thank you.
BlackProGen Live.
BlackProGen.
BlackProGen.
It's a place where evidence tells the stories.